The Y Curve with Phil Dobby and Roger Hearing.
War in Europe. Hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians continue to die each day in a conflict begun by Russia's invasion more than 3 months ago.
And there's no end in sight. So what about the organisation set up over 70 years ago precisely to defend Europe against an attack from Moscow? NATO is sitting this one out. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says they're doing what they can.
NATO is a defensive alliance, and the war in Ukraine is President Putin's war. This is a war that he has decided to conduct against an independent sovereign nation. And what NATO has been doing for many years is to support a sovereign independent nation in Europe, Ukraine. Train, assist and advise and equip the Ukrainian armed forces. That is what NATO allies and NATO have done for many years. This is not a threat to anyone. This is not a provocation, and that is what we continue to do.
In the last few days, the leaders of the world's biggest and oldest military alliance have been meeting in Madrid. Only 3 years ago, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, said NATO was brain dead.
I know that my statements created some reactions, shake a little bit. A lot of people, I do stand by.
But some now say Ukraine is the dose of adrenaline NATO needed. Finland and Sweden are queuing up to join. So this week on the Y Curve, we're asking, why is NATO still on the sidelines with Ukraine? Should it do more? Is NATO's lead member, the US, re-engaging with its European allies after years of pivoting to Asia?
And today we're asking, what is NATO's role? Is it doing enough to save Ukraine? And what are the risks it will have to actually fight the war with Moscow that it was set up to prevent 70 years ago?
Welcome to the Y Curve.
The Y Curve.
Yes, this week as NATO meets to discuss what next in the war in Ukraine, we've already heard that NATO is beefing up its rapid response force to 300,000 troops from around 40,000. That is a big increase, about an 8-fold increase. So things are certainly moving fast. And it seems Sweden and Finland will join the alliance. Turkey appears to have backed down from blocking their membership. And of course, we know one of the key principles of NATO is that an armed attack on one member nation would be considered as an attack on all, although Russia has sort of turned that around this week, haven't they? Saying that if anyone tries to attack or take back Crimea with the help of any NATO member, then that would mean war with all NATO members. So the rhetoric is really notching up, presumably because of this NATO get-together this week. So let's look at all of that with Defence and Security Editor at the Daily Telegraph, Dominic Nicholls.
Dom, welcome to the programme.
Hi guys. Hi Phil. Hi Roger.
Good to have you. So I guess the obvious first question is, what is the role of NATO these days?
Well, it is, as it has always been, a defensive alliance. The founding idea is enshrined in Article 5, which says an attack against one is an attack against all, and that if anybody has a go at one of the allies, then everyone else will pile in to a greater or lesser degree as they can. That has survived the test of time. NATO has morphed slightly over the years. It's taken on a kind of it's opined on global issues, but at its heart, it is as the name suggests, it is centred on the North Atlantic area. And the principal sort of adversary in that time, as we've seen in recent weeks, is Russia, and that's why it was set up. That's why it is there, re-energized, as you say now, after some decades of a little bit of drift, should we say? That's worth exploring. But yeah, it's back to its founding principles now, I'd say.
But it's being tested a little bit, isn't it, in those principles, in that it's there to defend each other. But here we have a situation where someone who's not a member would love to be a member, and it's trying to stick to those principles while helping out, which is why we've got this sort of proxy war going on.
It's in a tricky space because it is very clear that it will only come to the aid. And when I say it, of course, it's made up of 30 different sovereign nations, all of whom get a vote here. I mean, NATO can't take a decision and direct the UK, the US, or any other allies to go to war tomorrow. So NATO is a tricky organisation in that it's hard power. It is made up of allies, and it is defensive in nature. And yet, when it's challenged over values and ideals that are held by by all the allies to a greater or lesser degree. When those values are challenged, as we've seen in the war in Ukraine, NATO has felt, as we saw in the Balkan Wars, for example, that it should step in. The idea that might is right is no longer applicable in the 21st century, as it wasn't towards the end of the 20th century. And NATO feels like it should do something.
But Dom, it's more than that in this case, isn't it? Because it is an actual threat to actual members that they see there. I mean, yes, certainly principles are important with regard to Ukraine, but it's not difficult to see that Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland are all seeing Moscow as a very potential real threat to them, NATO members, right now.
Yes, and after the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, NATO came up with a mission called Enhanced Forward Presence, which saw a battle group taken from other NATO allies, a battle group of about 600 personnel stationed in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland. Since the invasion, that's now been extended to another 4 states down towards the rest of the eastern flank, and those battle groups in the north have been bolstered. For example, Britain is responsible for the battle group in Estonia, so we normally have 1 regiment's worth of people, tanks, and warrior infantry fighting vehicles. We've currently got 2 there, and there's some talk about, well, should that be permanent, or should instead of a battle group, should it be a brigade? And there's a lot of idea at the moment in NATO that this idea of having a tripwire along the eastern flank is no longer appropriate, because the allies there are saying, well, hang on a second, I don't want to be a tripwire. The tripwire implies that you'll come to my aid after 180 days once I get invaded. I'd rather not be invaded if it's all the same to you. So instead of just having a light footprint, there's talk of, well, should each of these battle groups be updone to a brigade, about 3 times the size? So there's a lot of debate at the moment in NATO about how it does deterrence, and the geographic centre is moving east, shall we say, especially if Finland and Sweden do join, and the Baltic states, the Nordic states, have been much more clear-eyed about the threat from Russia in recent years, and they want more hard power. So there's this idea that NATO has been reluctant to confront Russia, or has gone for a deterrence model of deterrence by punishment, i.e., if you do that, then we will do this. A lot of people are saying, well, you should move to a stronger deterrence posture and say, well, be so deterrent in your force construct that they don't, an adversary doesn't take you on in the first place. So there's a lot of debate at the moment in NATO about not so much what it's for, but how it achieves it.
Let me ask you then, Dom, because one of the problems with all this, I suppose, is the strong potential that what is now a proxy war, by the kind of advanced level of readiness that you've been talking about, the prospect of actual war comes closer almost inevitably, doesn't it? I mean, deterrence is one thing, but when you're actually there, nose to nose, boot to boot, if you like, with Russia, the prospect of actually fighting a war, which is what we're all trying to avoid, I guess, comes closer.
It does. It absolutely does. And NATO understands the risks here, I think. The debate about supply of equipment is very interesting. So you might remember MiG-gate from a couple of months ago, where Poland wanted to supply, I think it was about a dozen MiG-29s to Ukraine, and were hoping to be backfilled from the US by F-16s. And this was deemed an escalatory step too far. It was deemed it was going to be too provocative to Putin, and these MiG-29s would elicit a much harder response from Russia, possibly even attack on NATO.
Do you think that attitude is shifting now?
Well, I mean, it's interesting in that the debate on heavy weapons, so heavy artillery, longer range, better, more precise weapons, that's now shifted, and we're seeing HIMARS, a high mobility artillery rocket system, and multiple launch rocket systems being sent into Ukraine. Now, they have a much greater destructive power than a MiG-29. Of course, it depends what you fire your rockets at, but generally speaking, one MiG-29 fully bombed up is not as destructive as a HIMARS system or an MLRS system. So this idea earlier on in the war about what was escalatory and what was deemed provocative to Putin, not only did it give him a vote where he shouldn't really have had one, but it also, we've kind of moved beyond that now, as in, like I say, in terms of what you can actually do with these weapons. So NATO does seem to have moved on, although no main fighter jets have been sent. Spares have, and training for pilots and what have you, but there's not been a repeat of the MiG-29 affair. But no, NATO's trying to find a way through and see what at what line, where is the line Putin draws now over that he would be prepared to cross to take on NATO? It's highly unlikely that Putin would seek direct confrontation with NATO. But then it was highly unlikely that he would invade Ukraine on February the 24th. He did it.
Well, absolutely. Very, very few people thought it would actually happen.
And it's. I mean, if you look at the map, I mean, it's obvious what he's going to do next, isn't it? If he's there trying to say, well, okay, let's expand Russia to, the former Soviet era, or at the very least, let's secure a couple of seaports. You'd be looking at Kaliningrad, wouldn't you, and say, well, hang on, here's an isolated Russian province on the Baltic coast. You've got to get through Lithuania to get to it. So let's start working on that one.
Yeah, I mean, and you don't need to be a master strategist. You don't need to have played Risk since you were 12 years old. You don't need to have looked.
I was very good at that, by the way. I was brilliant at Risk in my.
Terrible. But we don't need to second guess this. He's done our thinking for us. His Peter the Great speech of a couple of weeks ago. I mean, if the mask didn't slip, it was sort of ripped off his face and cast across the floor with great aplomb. I mean, he made it absolutely clear in that speech in Russia that this is not about denazification or drug dealers or NATO encroachment. He made it very clear this is about territorial gain and going back to the old days of the Soviet Union and land. He's looking at geography. He's playing Risk, basically. He's seeing bits he wants to gobble up. So he's very clear that this is about land and trying to reclaim territory. Never mind that Kaliningrad used to be Königsberg and was part of Prussia and Germany, blah blah blah, etc. etc. I mean, he's very selective from history about which bits he says were part of the Soviet Empire.
And do you think perhaps that what you're talking about there may lie behind the change that we've seen, quite radical change, in two leading members of NATO, France and Germany, seen as extremely reluctant to give weapons to the Ukrainians and perhaps on the wing of saying, shouldn't we compromise, provide Putin with a way back? And certainly Ukrainians I've been talking to, Ukrainian friends have said that has actually changed in the last couple of weeks when the French and German leaders went to Kyiv quite recently. Suddenly the impression was, okay, they're back on board, and maybe that's because they realise what you're saying about the nature of the Putin threat.
I think they've been forced to. Germany, in particular, has had a rough ride. I mean, for me and others, about the lukewarm response in terms of arms supplies initially. I mean, they are now have promised to supply multiple launch rocket systems, have promised to supply the Gepard anti-air weapon, very capable. Quite old, but very capable piece of equipment, twin 35mm cannons that will do for helicopters, drones, and any fast jet that's holding a straight and level profile. I mean, they are very, very capable pieces of equipment. But I've said Germany have had some questions to answer on this. But if you look at how Scholz has had to turn the supertanker of domestic German politics around into this much more martial stance. I mean, we are 125 days into the war, 126. I have to do my maths, take my shoes off and start counting. But, I mean, it's 4 months. Got lots of toast. But, I mean, he's had a tough time to change decades of German policy. France, less so, but equally, France have supplied the Caesar 155mm self-propelled artillery piece, another very, very capable piece of heavy artillery. So France have been doing some bits and pieces. I mean, there've been some of the comments from Mr. Macron and saying that you should always keep an open line to Russia. It's always better to talk than fight. I mean, yeah, he
was very much a phone a friend for a while for Putin. It seemed, didn't he? He seemed to be on the phone all the time too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting you should never try and talk, but at what point does that become a useful idiot as far as Putin is concerned? So, these guys are struggling with their domestic politics, struggling a bit with the historical politics. I mean, it has been such a shock to the European security architecture what Putin has done. Even those that have been warning about it, and I say the eastern flank, the Nordic states, Baltic states, much more clear-eyed than many others. I mean, it still took them by surprise. They might have expected something, but I mean, a lot of people were saying they didn't expect the speed or ferocity or the or quite frankly, the inept nature of the invasion.
That's been the saving grace, hasn't it? So does this mean then that, we are going to spend a lot more? So, I mean, Donald Trump, of course, his bugbear was that the rest of the world wasn't spending as much on defence as they were. And you look at Germany, 1.5% of GDP, according to NATO's own numbers, compared to 3.5% in the United States. We're 2.3% for the UK. We're one of the good ones in terms of, 2.9% for Greece, 2.3% for Estonia, but most of the NATO members are spending well below 2%. So I'm sort of assuming that the first outcome out of all of this is defence spending worldwide by NATO members is going to move up quite a notch.
You'd hope so. I mean, the numbers are going in the right direction, but they should have been there anyway. And these are policy commitments. No one can hide from the threat now. It's not as if it's a sunk cost. Many people think that defence is a break glass in emergency type of Department of State, and you don't actually need to do anything right up to the point of war. Well, firstly, that's a failed argument. I mean, you that just can't work. And secondly, you can never say never anymore. I mean, Putin did invade Ukraine on February 24th, and has made these statements about the other states in the former Soviet Union. So, defence spending in those countries that are under the NATO 2% minimum should go up, and they're making the right noises. I mean, it's yet to see if everyone does get up there. It's also a way of worth thinking about, well, what does defence mean, and where does the money go? And in Britain, we're not entirely blameless here. There's some chat about, well, how much of your pension contributions are you actually counting in that percentage? And so if you take that out, are you at 2% or you're slightly under? So there's different ways of cutting the cake. But I mean, nobody can say now's the time to cut defence spending, and we've been lavishly sort of fire hosing this cash around NATO willy-nilly. I mean, this is simply not the case, and nobody is making that argument, to be fair. But then, good luck to them if they tried.
I mean, I suppose one question I think is the back of some people's minds is that all the stuff we're sending to Ukraine, and the others around Europe are doing as well, and the Americans, comes from our own stockpiles. So is there a moment where we say, hang on a second, we're getting a bit thin on our own stocks by sending all our top and best weapons to Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, there will be a point. I've been asking that question, and I wasn't expecting an answer, quite frankly, nor did I get one in terms of operational security. And MOD are not saying how much is left or how long it takes to produce an N-law missile or a Javelin anti-air missile or what have you. It has shone a light on an area of defence procurement that's very heavily in that boring but important category, and that is stockpiles and the supply chain and the relationship between the Ministry of Defence and industry. The current and relatively new Chief of Defence Staff, Admiral Tony Radakin, he's very clear that there needs to be a lot more money spent on stockpiling and that link with the supply chain. As is the Defence Secretary, he said it as well, Ben Wallace. So this is not unusual. However, there is a tendency in the military, if they get a new wad of cash to go and spend on stuff, they go and invest in research and development, which is always good. They go and buy the newest shiny thing, which is pretty good, I suppose, because it's new. What they don't do is they don't sort of put a load of cash into all the boring bits you don't see behind the scenes that you may actually never use, but come the day of the race, you blooming well need to get your hands on.
Yeah. So this figure of, how much is spent, what proportion of GDP, I guess the thing from the public's point of view that they've had difficulty getting their head around is that number, how much of that is spent on defence versus other essential services. So that 3.5% that they're spending in the US is about as much as they spend on state education, which sounds horrendous. And you can understand why there'd be reticence on the part of the public in this country and in Europe, because there's not been much need or much call for it. But I wonder whether that attitude is shifting now. I mean, it's sad that it's had to shift, but I mean, it obviously we've all been shocked by what's happened in Ukraine. And we realise now we do have to spend money on this sort of stuff.
Yes, but not everybody has to spend their money on everything. And that's what an alliance is about. And that's why those that, it's a bit like taxation, those with the broadest shoulders should carry the heaviest load. But that's not to say that some other nations have some very capable, if niche, areas of particular interest that their domestic industry, academia, R&D foundations have put forward. So across the alliance, you want to be able to have an effective defence and an effective answer to every form of problem, from humanitarian up to conventional war fighting and indeed nuclear war fighting. But that doesn't mean that everybody has to do everything. And I think NATO has a much better idea of who can and should do what now.
So is it NATO all the way now? Because there is the danger is, of course, that NATO has been dominated so much by the US, because they, of course, say, well, we're putting the most money in and we're, leader of the free world. And everyone almost has to kowtow, even though, there's got to be an agreement generally in what direction they take. US is leading the way there. What happens in a situation like this if US just goes, actually, we're a bit bored with that war now. We feel as though it's not affecting us as much as it's affecting Europe. We're going to lessen our involvement, and NATO takes a step back, whereas the European members are being, well, no, actually, we want to do more. I mean, is that part of the problem with NATO? It's not a unified force, as you said at the very beginning. It's got members. It's a democratic force.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first point to note is that differences of opinion are good and are healthy up to a point, and after that, only do they become sort of fractures and cracks in the alliance and rows and all the other headlines you want to see, and of course all the headlines that Putin would be very happy to try and stick a crowbar in and leave her apart, make those gaps wider. So when we see these debates out in the open, Putin's very clear to say, the alliance is collapsing. Whereas it's far from the truth. This is what, if you put 30 people in a room, you're going to get a lot of different opinions. That's what a good, healthy democracy does. But the other thing to remember is that a lot of these big decisions about whether or not to support Ukraine, and if so, how and how much and for how long, that's not NATO. It might be exercised through NATO mechanisms in terms of physically moving some of this equipment into Ukraine, providing the training of the personnel that need to then go and use those capabilities. But these are national decisions, and national decisions are separate from NATO decisions. So it's not to suggest that any country that might want to take a less forward-leaning stance, shall we say, is less forward-leaning, backward-leaning? Not quite sure. Anyway,
leaning around anyway. Yeah,
we're wobbling about a bit of a weeble, a NATO weeble. I mean that's a national position. That's not necessarily NATO's position. So NATO, essentially, since NATO was formed, it's been in crisis. There's always been debate about, what's NATO for, and has it got 5 years to live? It's got to prove itself in the next 5 years, or NATO will collapse. I mean, that has been the example of NATO since it was first created, and now I think it's firmer than ever in terms of what it's for and the threat that it's facing. But some of these bigger decisions are national decisions, albeit enacted through the mechanisms of NATO.
Now, Dom, the next bit I want to come on to really is we talk a lot about the theory, the practice, in the sense where a lot of weapons are going into Ukraine, as you say, on a national basis, perhaps rather than NATO, although some NATO coordination. Is it enough? Because in the end, if this battle is lost, if this war is lost, if Putin can at some point declare victory, if Ukraine is forced to make concessions, a lot of people will read into that, I suppose, something about the strength of the NATO nations as well. I mean, what's your sense at the moment in military terms as to whether Ukraine is getting enough to be able to sustain itself and keep Putin at least to a standoff, if not actually force him into defeat?
Well, winning and defeat are very loaded terms. I mean, if you look at where the lines are at the moment on the map of Ukraine, Russia has lost strategically. It's not been able to cut off the head of the Ukrainian leadership, install a client regime, et cetera, even if it allowed Ukraine to exist as a sovereign state. It's not a buffer state of Russia. So it's failed in that endeavor. It's failed to cut off the south completely. That's why Odessa was so vulnerable and has been defended so heavily, and why the Black Sea is critical and Snake Island is critical, because if Ukraine lose Odessa, either through amphibious assault or by any other means, then they do not, their main economic lifeline is cut off. So what's Russia achieved here? Well, they've managed to extend the boundaries a little bit from where they were in 2014, but it's come at such enormous cost. So you've got to wonder what Russia has got out of this. I mean, they're going to be international pariahs now for decades. Putin in particular. So what has Ukraine got to do to win? Well, it's just got to hang on, basically, for now. That, I think, is why there was such a fight over Severodonetsk. I mean, a large industrial plant there, but no major transport hub, no major political hub. But what it was doing was soaking up Russian capability, the same as the fighters down in the Azovstal plant in Mariupol. They put up a staunch resistance for weeks when it had very little tactical significance, virtually no strategic significance. And yet they held on there and bled the Russian military force, basically.
So you think Ukraine can hang on? You think it actually, I mean, there's been impression, obviously, of Severodonetsk, of a select pullback, but you think actually months, weeks, years possibly ahead, it will hold the line?
Well,
because there's still territory lost. There's still territory lost, isn't there? Even if we finished where we are now, Russia could say, well, we've gained territory.
Yeah. Well, look,
Putin
controls his media. He can declare victory tomorrow if he wants. He can say whatever he likes. He can get out of this. We talk about saving his face, or Putin talk about don't humiliate him. Listen, he controls that. It's not up to us to have to do that. He will spin it through his media any way he likes. So we don't need to worry about any of that. So, can Ukraine hang on and win? Yeah, possibly with the amount of weapons and supplies and training that's going in there. But that's not to suggest that if they weren't, that there's going to be some mass armored breakout by Russia and they're going to be at the Dnipro River in 48 hours. I mean, they've shown themselves to be tactically and strategically inept. Their equipment is old and broken. They're having to get old men back into uniform. They are not able to piece together any particular military advances. We think General Dvornikov, who was put in overall charge after the chaos of them being kicked out of the north of the country, we think he's been sacked himself. So they're not able to operate as an army, as a military. There seem to be a number of different army campaigns going on and an air force campaign, and then something happening down in the Black Sea. It doesn't really seem to be too coordinated and working out what's the priority and how you're going to get there, and then apportioning resource to that, and so on and so forth. All the other lectures that I slept through at Staff College. But, I mean, they've just shown themselves to be just a bit rubbish, quite frankly. And so even if Ukraine do not get these heavy weapons and the training, the idea that Russia has the capability, physically has the personnel and the equipment to drive west in a mass armoured thrust and get to Kyiv and take over the country, I just find it fanciful. Now, that's not to say they can't do a huge amount of damage in terms of killing people and denuding Ukraine's economic viability in the meantime. And that's kind of what we see with these artillery strikes in population centres and missile strikes against areas of very dubious military value. So there is still a huge price that Ukraine may have to pay for hanging in there, and that leaves room for the arguments about, well, maybe they should try and do a deal now. Trouble is, neither side is going to do a deal. No negotiations will start in earnest until at least one side, and preferably both, feel that they will gain more from negotiations than they will from the battlefield. And at the moment, I think Ukraine feels that it is gaining on the battlefield, gaining firstly by just existing and holding the line, or allowing only very small incremental advances by the Russian force. And on the Russian side, I mean, they are not progressing much at all. But no one's prepared to turn around and say this isn't working. So they're not going to say we need to negotiate. So at the moment, both sides still see the result, the answer being on the battlefield.
So how do we ensure that this doesn't happen again? How do we ensure that NATO is operating more efficiently? You talked about NATO really, the decisions are made by the individual members. So and obviously Europe is is a collective of countries, but it's also a union of countries as well. And there was talk in the past about, this idea was largely poo-pooed, but the idea of a European army. But if Europe was collectively a NATO single entity, which was able to coordinate how it spent its money, where it resourced what sorts of defense, where it did the research, where it built stuff, where the armaments went, it could have a more coordinated approach than a series of individual countries, couldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it might do, but it wouldn't have the budget. I mean, NATO does have some of its own kit. It's got some long-range surveillance drones that NATO owns that is not provided by member states.
But if they're pooling their money, if every European country said, right, we're going to get up to that, we're going to match. I mean, this is fanciful, but we're going to match that 3.5% of GDP that the US is managing. Then you'd get up to, similar size GDP for the US and Europe. You'd get up to the similar sort of, I think we'd get a 15 or 20%.
Yeah, the Germans could afford it, clearly.
Yeah. So, if there was a commitment to do it, would it make more sense if you're spending more money to try and coordinate it? And not necessarily advocating a European army, but it's an interesting point of discussion, isn't it? Can you get more coordination if you said, well, okay, Europe has been really running NATO in effect. Let's try and shift the balance of power because the real concern is on our doorstep.
Yeah, I don't think that would get through the domestic politics of all the alliance members, but also the idea that NATO has got this wrong and deterrence has failed, I think is flawed because since NATO has existed, no NATO state has been attacked. Okay, you could talk about cyber, and that's an interesting area, and that's a massive area actually. But in terms of the hard power, then NATO kind of worked. These debates about what does deterrence, what posture do you want for the deterrence outcome that you desire? That is a live debate, as I've described. So there are ways of doing it, but NATO in and of itself, I don't think would look at it right now and say, "Oh, fellas, we got this one wrong. We got to go back to square one and start again." NATO and yet, US is spending a great deal. I mean, how that money is spent, the US spends a great deal of money on technology. The rest of NATO is spending a great deal on procurement. A lot of it is buying US developed technology. I mean, if we're going to move forward and spend more, I'm sure European nations like BAE Systems, for example, and Airbus and the like would be saying, well, okay, we want a bigger slice of this pie because we've got brain power here too. Yeah, I mean, look at the F-35 fighter, depending which variant you go for, but let's say broad figure, $100 million a piece. There's a bit of the F-35 comes from every single US state. Now, is that just happens to be where those industries are, or is there domestic politics to play there? I think it's very much the latter. The debate about the next generation fighter jet is that we in Britain, do we just say, well, I'll tell you what, F-35 is pretty good and F-16, let's just get a few of those, or do we want to have our own sovereign defence capability so that we can make our own choices, have our own industry? I was speaking to the shadow John Healy, shadow defence minister, some time ago, and I was asking him about the old idea of where you put your defence money. Do you, for example, buy your fleet support ships from South Korea, where they are cheaper and you sort of get literally more bang for your buck, yet more of them for the amount of money you're willing to spend, or do you spend that money in UK and get fewer ships, literally smaller number of ships, but a lot of the money flows back into the UK in terms of wages and so on and so forth. And this debate has been rolling around for decades, forever, probably.
Did he give an answer to that question?
Yeah, no, he was very clear. He said it should go to the UK, which I said, well, that was an interesting policy position. That's not been so explicitly stated before. So it's seeing the defence budget partly as a domestic consideration, whereas you would want your military to have the best equipment they could have, even if that, debate, do you want your military to have the best equipment it can, even if that means that the money and therefore the jobs, some jobs are overseas, or do you see it as a domestic job creation scheme, in which case you funnel it into the UK? It might take longer, might be more expensive, you'll get fewer items of equipment for the same amount of spend, but the money goes into UK taxpayers' pockets and is spent in our high streets and so on and so forth. I mean, it is both are perfectly reasonable policy positions. It's just that the Labour Party.
Well, the ideal outcome would be that actually we develop more that is procured globally, wouldn't it? That we and maybe
we are the fount of all the wisdom that goes into the defence industry, and and therefore the money comes to us.
Yeah,
as well.
So in the ideal world, I guess the advantage in the United States as well is that a lot of the money that is invested in defence, in this research and development, which is state funded or individual state funded as well as federally funded, a lot of that technology is then used in non-defence areas as well, which, it's the intelligence that grows.
Dom, just as we bring this to a close, obviously the defence procurement thing is a whole area that could go on very complicated and difficult to resolve.
And you bring in cyberspace right at the end as well. There's a whole other podcast there.
Well, let's just take one line just to finish this off, which is, given that NATO's position in this and this proxy war it's fighting, what do you personally think, Dom, are the risks of NATO being drawn into this war, whether Putin wants them to, whether NATO wants them to, that in this situation, almost unprecedented, the scale of war in Europe in the last half century, what are the risks that NATO will be drawn into an actual fighting part of this war?
I think slim, which I think cedes the advantage to Russia, because they will know that I think any decision NATO would be would lean on the risk-averse side of the ledger. And I'm thinking in terms of the maritime flank here in Ukraine, trying to get the grain out. So you could look to the Black Sea nations, let's say Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria, those with a coastline in the Black Sea. You could say they're very capable countries with a good defence capabilities. So they could put together a sort of maritime coalition of the willing to break the blockade and say, well, we are going to escort these ships through to Odessa to get the grain out and feed the world, etc., etc. Now they might elect to do that as an individual basis, or as a sort of, like I say, a coalition of the willing. There's been talk of Egypt getting involved with that kind of plan. But Putin would paint this as NATO, because they are NATO members. Even if NATO say, look, it's nothing to do with us. If Turkey want to send their ships up there and protect the grain supplies, and they're going to do it with a bit of help from Romania and a bit of help from Bulgaria, that's up to them. But Putin will paint that as NATO. So NATO as an armed body, the North Atlantic Council, are not going to sit down and say, right, let's go and take the fight to Russia. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But individual countries taking action, no matter how they want to categorize it, if Putin says, well, this is NATO doing X, Y, and Z, so the idea of NATO involvement might be introduced against their will, and then suddenly it might be politically too damaging for those countries to do that. In which case, it's a very tricky position to be in.
The big wars begin by accident in Europe, as we know, in the past, and people, whether it's sleepwalking into it or incidents, of course, can precipitate this. Dom, we're going to have to end it there. Thanks so much for being with us here on the Y Curve. That's Dominic Nicholls, Defence and Security Editor at the Daily Telegraph, in a very interesting and rather pertinent edition of the Y Curve.
Yeah, thanks, Dom.
Thanks, guys.
And next week, we stomp heavy-footed into another battleground. We haven't lined up our guest yet, but I'm sure we'll be able to pull it together. We're going to look at the big debate on gender fluidity. Imagine two middle-aged white guys trying to get on top of that one without upsetting anyone. Can that be done? Probably not. We're bound to upset someone, but, for people of our age, it is difficult to make sense of it all. So we'll give all of that the Y-curve treatment next week. See you then.
The Y Curve.